Well, huh? Is it working? Okay, yes. Okay, thank you, Adrian Wells and the ENEX media professionals. First of all, let me say that I'm glad that you made the trip to Hamburg and that you visit us in our city, as you already found out, is a beautiful city, a city that its citizens call her the most beautiful city in the world. We'll have to talk about this, but nonetheless, that's what they are saying. I wasn't born here, so I can just quote people who were. And in fact, it's a city that is for centuries a media city as well. So it's also rather plausible that you found your way here because there's a big port where a lot of goods were traded over centuries. Of course, a lot of informations were traded as well. And the merchants and the fine businessmen that the Hamburg people were for centuries found out that you could also sell information and that you could try to make a living out of this. And so even in the 18th century, we had the highest circulated newspaper already coming from Hamburg, the Hamburgische Kurier at that time. And especially after World War II, in the reestablishment of the media scene in Germany, Hamburg was the hotspot for Western Germany, where a lot of the famous brands that are still around today were actually found, established, and led to forces for a democratic society. And we hope to continue that in the future. And today we are also German headquarter for Google, for Facebook, for Snap, and for other big tech companies as well, who have an impact on the media market, as you already pointed out. But since you know your business models and since you know your technological environments and all the stuff that's going on around your business, and you don't need a politician to come to lecture you on what is actually going on in the industry related issues, let me broaden the topic a little bit to the beginning. I was already telling that I intend to talk a little bit about the death of truth and what to do about this. And I want to start with a quote from one of my colleagues. And I don't know if you ever heard of Mon Mothma, because I would like to share a few lines from one of her speeches with you. Yeah, okay, some heard. Yeah, that's good. I believe we are in crisis. The distance between what is said and what is known to be true has become an abyss. Of all the things at risk, the loss of an objective reality is perhaps the most dangerous. The death of truth is the ultimate victory of evil. When truth leaves us, when we let it slip away, when it is ripped from our hands, we become vulnerable to the appetite of whatever monster screams the loudest. And those are fierce words from a determined, courageous, and combative politician, someone who has what we would call probably moral steadfastness in her speech. And it's a speech of a senator, as I found out, as I said, who is anxious to establish the truth and is concerned about what will happen if truth no longer exists. And before you now start to ask how one spells Mon Mothma and try to find out who Google her and who she is actually a character from the fictitious TV show or Disney show Andor, one of the prequel series of Star Wars. And she is one of the people who were joining the rebellion right after the speech that she gave in the Galactic Senate in opposition to what was going on there. And this TV show is kind of like a very interesting and very well researched thought about what happens if authoritarianism tends to slip away into fascism, and what happens when political and social designs change and a regime actually becomes quite completely toxic. And the loss of a fact based confrontation with reality is bewailed in the work of fiction in this time, and perhaps more accurately, science fiction. It's a two-tier game of deception. But what's interesting is that a couple of weeks ago, when in the US they took Jimmy Kimmel off the air, the head author of Andor, who just won an Emmy for the series, made a very compelling statement to the public. And he was saying, Dan Gilroy is his name, he was saying that actually we are at the moment in a situation that is no longer a skirmish, he said, but a siege. And then he added, whether you're reading this online at Blue Bottle or killing time before your 3 o'clock Zoom or staring at a glowing screen, unable to sleep, we have all become characters in a story where our actions actually carry weight and consequence. And he carried on and he said that there will be a time, not so far in the future, when fate would knock at the door and ask people to choose between conscience and hardship. And this goes out to everybody in the media industry at our time. Conscience or hardship. That's the choice that we have to make, he says. And I'm delighted to share some thoughts with you about this death of truth and the notion that goes along with it, because it's something that I think we see in a lot of different developments at the moment in our public spheres and in the media business as well, because what we see is information that is pushed away by deliberate disinformation, where facts are no longer verified and where alternative or felt or questions of faith decide what is a fact and what is not. And what responsibility do media companies and policymakers share in the face of this complex situation and the development that we see at the moment? All of you know it only too well. In the age of attention economics, of social echo chambers, and of AI-controlled algorithms, far more is at stake than business models which were devised in an age which no one could have imagined, that we would consume news on our mobile phones or that messages could be produced by anyone on any device that we have with us and be disseminated globally within seconds or microseconds. A few short years ago, it was impossible to predict either the speed with which new media offerings would be adopted or the rapidity and quantity with which news would be disseminated all around the world, and how fast and effectively it would be possible to react to them. And that is not even getting into the exponential growth of AI that we are seeing at the moment, and we are not quite sure how this will end up in the end. What is at stake in the age of the death of truth, or of hyper-reaction, as some authors call it, is more than the quality of news. In fact, what is at stake is freedom of expression, is, in the long run, democracy. Not only the fiction characters, like the one I quoted in the beginning, comes to the conclusion that a loss of objective reality is perhaps the most dangerous thing, and that death of truth is the ultimate victory of evil. A couple of years ago, a colleague of you, the journalist Michiko Kakutani, the famous literature critics from the New York Times, feared by any American author whatsoever, wrote a little book in 2018 also called The Death of Truth, about the way that Donald Trump communicates in public. And she wrote, "A disregard for facts, the displacement of reason by emotion, and the corrosion of language are diminishing the very value of truth." And she argued that the idea of postmodern narration, of the idea that everybody has their own perspective, has their own story to tell, and it's actually freeing and enlightening to have all these different stories out there in the public sphere, tends to slip into something completely different in the moment when also the powerful uses the idea of, well, everyone has just their story and is entitled to tell their story, and not trying to find out what story actually resonates and is true. She was saying that it was basically that everyone is holding a megaphone, and the one who has the loudest megaphone and screams into it the loudest also wins the public debate. And not the question of debate, of deliberation, of actually what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is false in the public sphere, organized within reason. And all of this leads us to a situation where, in the Global Risk Report of 2025, the World Economic Forum, I don't know if you know the lists, risks among the greatest risks of our time. On position number 1, state-based armed conflicts. On number 2, extreme weather events. On number 3, geo-economic confrontation. On number 4, misinformation and disinformation. And on number 5, societal polarization. So we have the consequences of what is going on there already in the top 5 of the global risks, so concluded by the World Economic Forum. And the question of how we are going to deal with this is important. The political thinker Hannah Arendt once remarked, "The greatest danger is not lying, but getting accustomed to it." And that is something that goes very well for our today's public spheres. Not the lying, but the fact that we get accustomed to there being so many lies out there. And that's why it is so important that networks like ENEX actually say that we want to do something against this, that you say the motto is strong news. that you're looking for alliances also with policymakers in order to find out what you can do. For example, last year on the occasion of the European elections, what you can do in order to preserve the integrity of an election process and of the public debate that goes along with this election process. Because we need reliable and comprehensive news for the democratic understanding that everybody knows everything they need to know in order to engage in the public discourse is still valid today. And that's not so sensible and self-evident the case like it was in the past. And we need to reject the stories of impending doom as well. Because when you go around at the moment and when somebody like me comes up to a podium and talks about the death of truth, we usually lay flat at the very first, okay, not another dystopian story, please leave away with it. But then on the other hand, journalism is about that. Journalism is about finding out what goes wrong, reporting it in order for society to make it better. But what in a social situation where everybody is thinking that everything goes down the drain anyhow? And that basically is at least the situation in Germany. I don't think just Germany, but many developed economic and industrial countries, the public sphere thinks, well, we are doomed. Maybe, just maybe in a situation like this, the success story becomes news. The instance where in a society something actually works out, not necessarily by politics, maybe by civil society, by businesses, but where things actually are tried out in a different way and start to appear to function against all odds. I think those are news as well, and those are news that we need at times to shake us away from the idea that everything is going down and that we are not able to do anything. I really think that we need to strive out for something like new narratives and new stories that actually help us as a society to not let the idea that we can do better in the future than we are doing today is basically going away, it's vanishing, and we have just to accommodate ourselves with, with the thought that we can't do anything about it. And I think that telling stories, which is what all of you do, is something that makes us human. There's a famous book by two German journalists, Samira El-Wasil and Friedemann Karik, and they call their studies Erzählende Affen, narrative apes. So that's what we all are. We are all just apes telling ourselves stories. That differentiates us from other apes who are not able to tell us stories. And we are telling those stories in order to make sense of the world that we live in. And we need those stories. And from journalism, we need those stories to be true, not just to be fictitious. Fictitious can be Andor. They can just pop our heads into something that we have no idea about. But journalism needs to tell stories that are true in the end. And so journalism needs to do something against a situation where the lies are so terribly nice and exciting that they spread like wildfire, whereas on the truth, on the other hand, is so boring that it just simply fizzles out and comes to a sticky end. And we need to think hard about how to tell true stories in a way that they actually find resonance in the public sphere and hold up with those who just call their social networks truth social, but have no inclination of telling any sort of truth other than the one that fosters their own ideas and then their own power. And when I was a trainee at a German regional newspaper some 25 years ago, I was confronted with a sentence that I'm still fighting very hard. And the sentence in German is Fakten hemmen den Erzählfluss. Facts impede the steady flow of the narrative, you might say. That was what one of the editors said when he was doing something very brutal to what I found was a beautiful report that I had written, and he just slashed it away and made something far less beautiful of it, I thought. And he was saying, Fakten hemmen den Erzählfluss. The facts impede the steady flow of the narrative. And I think that's utterly wrong. I really think I do. And I think that when we engage into that kind of thinking, we're already lost. Because what we need to do is foster the belief that facts make a significant contribution to the steady flow of a narrative. And we are interested, and our audiences are interested in the next facts, the facts that keep the steady flow of the narrative going. What is the next step into this? What is happening there? And journalists are just kind of like the experts, not just for the facts that are in this, but also for the context that these facts are being put in. You are the ones that put up the broader picture in which the new fact actually can be weighed, can be measured, can be valued with the public audience in order to understand what is going on in our societies. And so what you are doing is something that needs our help as policymakers as well, if we want to provide access to reliable information, if we want to create contexts to better understand and thus strengthen democracy and freedom of speech. That's the point where we actually need an alliance between politics and media. Not as like working together on everything, but working together on the framework of a democratic public sphere, so that then, going on from there, we can go all against one another in our different roles. Us, the ones that we want to convince the public sphere of something, what we think is right and what we think that we need to be doing, and you telling us where we are all wrong, where we need to do something else, or just spreading the information and spreading also the counter speech of what we are trying to do. But we need a framework that we all agree upon and that we all accept in which this can take place. And part of that framework is the fact that we also need the notion that truth is part of this design of public sphere. And then, in the next thing, we can think of what we need and how we can maybe even as politics help you to design strong specialist editorial desks, strong content alternatives to classical media products, strong alliances for common standards, independent digital distribution channels, or also a common technology development capable of facilitating new kinds of scalability. All things that the media industry need to tackle as an issue, but something that we can provide the framework for as an innovation-based and democracy-driven politics there as well. And in Hamburg, we are trying to do just that with a lot of initiatives I'm not going to bore you with, but if you ask your colleagues from Hamburg, they can tell you a lot about things like Beyond Platforms initiatives, where we try out new distribution ideas between public broadcasters and private broadcasters on how to actually bring content in the video and audio today to audiences in a different setting where we don't necessarily need global platforms as well. We're talking about Use the News, which is a big network that we designed here a couple of years ago that now works nationwide, that brings together media houses, science, big foundations and the public and the state in order to try to find out how we actually can foster news competence with younger people, younger audience, to bring them to the value of what news media are all about and why they are still necessary, maybe even more necessary than they were in the past. We just founded a competence center for young audiences where we're trying to design ideas and ways of actually reaching these young audiences and also testing out new forms of helping them with learning on how to use journalistic efforts in order to let the free flow of information in our societies actually have a future as well. And in the end, it all comes down to the fact that we need to hold steadfast to the idea that something like truth is possible. And last Saturday, I had a big talk with one of the most famous German journalists, Caroline Emke, here at the Schauspielhaus at the big theater, and she was presenting her new book, and her book ended with a speech that she gave earlier this year about the rise of right-wing extremism in Germany as well. And in the end of that speech, she asked a question. I want to leave you with the question and the tentative answer that she gave in that evening in that speech. And she asked, what can we do in the face of rising right-wing extremism, of rising diminishing of the idea of truth? And she answered, to support others each and every day, and not only ourselves, to cling to the notion each and every day that there are criteria capable of establishing the truth, that there is such a thing as reality. And I think that's a very, very valuable thought, to cling to criteria capable of establishing the truth that there is such a thing as reality. And who else, if not journalists, are doing exactly that? And that's why you matter, that's why we need you, and that's why we have a common obligation to make sure that journalism has a future, because if journalism doesn't have a future, democracy doesn't have a future. And so it's one of the top priorities, I think, of democratic politics to make sure that journalism has a future. And so I'm very glad that you are here in Hamburg discussing all the obstacles that you are facing and trying to find out ways in order to make journalism possible and thriving and healthy and powerful for the next decades and centuries to come, so that there will never be a Mon Mothma in Germany giving a speech about death of truth, or in any of the countries that you are coming from. It's great to have you. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. We managed to get Star Wars in there. That's great. I hadn't predicted that. So any questions from the audience? Anyone who... Yes. Okay. Jose Gomez from SIC Portugal.
Yeah.
I'm Jose from Portugal. Yes. Thank you for having introduced me. Mr. Minister of Culture of Germany, we in Portugal, we have highly regulated sector referring to traditional means like TV, as I belong to, and printed editions and radio and so on. They are highly regulated and supervised. But digital editions, as to say, the publications, blogs and so on, they're not regulated. I think it's the same in Germany. What can we do in order to impose patterns, in order to respect the truth in these media, in these digital media?
Oh, that's the big question. Actually, it's basically the same situation in Germany, a little bit different because our situation with the media regulation is much more fragmented. We have very little regulation on the classic print media. Where what is highly regulated is the audiovisual media, especially coming from the public broadcasters and then also from the private broadcasters. And then, of course, we have European regulation concerning digital media and digital media outlets. We designed several years ago a straight treaty because media policies are in Germany not something for the federal government, but for the 16 states that make up Germany. We designed a state treaty between these 16 länder in order to establish some ground rules for digital communication as well, concerning the questions of variety of issues, of the variety of content, and a little bit about the transparency of the criteria for search, for presentation, and so stuff like that. And we had very much trouble with the European Union and the European Commission in order to get this thing notified in Brussels, because they said that everything that we were doing is actually all being dealt with on a European level, which is not the fact, because Europe has no mandate in regulating media or the public sphere or cultural affairs. What they can manage and regulate are markets and their consumer protection rights. And those are the two doors that they go through, but they have no idea of what to do actually with the variety of issues and of content within the public sphere. So we insisted, and in the end, they gave in, and we had our regulation in place now, and we are now redrafting these treaties due to all the stuff that has emerged over the last years, because, as you know, the development of technologies is much faster than we see. So that is one thing, establish some ground rules there as well. And on the other hand, probably in some of the parts where we have very heavy regulation, lift some of that regulation as well, because it's not so plausible that mass broadcast has the same impact it had 50, 60 years ago, when people came up with this, being always anxious of people being manipulated by these powerful TV stations. I think those times have passed as well, in order to maybe then in the end get some sort of not level playing field probably, but a sort of more aligned playing field in a couple of decades, just lightening regulation there and imposing some regulation there in order to meet there. But it's a strong fight, especially since our last state treaty, the European Union has also passed the Digital Service Act and the European Media Freedom Act, with both of which they said, we've basically done all your work. You don't have anything to do. And we see all the holes that are in this regulation, and we're still trying to fill this. It's going to be quite interesting. And I hope other European countries will follow, because the more European countries actually think about ideas of how to regulate the frameworks of their own public spheres, it's much more plausible to be effective in Brussels as well. If it's not just the Germans who invent some new laws, like Germans always do, because we always invent laws when we see a problem. We see about that. But I think we need ground rules, and we need a competent audience. That's the other thing, because a lot of the things that we complain about, a lot of the things, the attractiveness of lies, the attractiveness of disinformation, of polarization, also has something to do with the answer to the questions, what do we interact with in the internet? And we can see this. We have the Hans Bredow Institute, one of the big media research institutions of Germany here in Hamburg. I don't know if you visit them, but they're part of the Reuters Global News Report every year. And when the Reuters Global News Report looks at how actually does social media work and how does reaction at social media platforms work, you can see one thing. If you ask people on social media platforms, where do you see yourself from left to right, 1 to 10, you get like this normal curve that you know from all these questions. And most of the people just cling there in the middle, 4 to 6. That's where they all see themselves, somewhere in the middle of society and political discourse. When you ask who is interacting with what's going on in social media, this curve just goes exactly the other way around. Then the people on the fringes interact. And of course they do, because they find more things that they are not interested in, that they are not happy with. And I don't know what you're doing. I don't interact if I'm just mildly content. I'm just sort of happy with what's going on, and I just click through. If I'm raged about something, or I want to rant, then I'm going to interact. And that's, of course, what the algorithm learns. The algorithm learns when we are aggravated by something. And that's what it then, in the end, gratifies and leads us to. So that's why social media not just is evil in itself, but shows us how the human psyche works. And if we don't change that, we'll always lose this battle against the technology, who just tells us very cold what we are like. And we are probably a lot more polarized than we thought we were when we strip away all those civilized ideas that we have once we're in a room and we're engaging in like sort of like a decent common discourse with one another, just sitting home alone, ranting about the state of society. So we need to do that, but that's something that has to do a lot with education, has a lot to do with then also competences in audiences that we need to foster.
One more question I think we have time for. Anyone? Sonia, we have to defer to you, Sonia.
Sonja from RTL Nord. We've talked about news, which is part of the creative sector, but we will hear more about AI and business models. The dilemma we are all facing is we want to embrace new technology like AI, for example, and on the other hand, we have to protect intellectual property and make sure we can keep up the added value from our work. What is your view on how we can face that dilemma? Where's the solution? So it's not the death of truth, but the birth of creativity in the new AI age, maybe.
I mean, my colleague on the federal level just spoke the other day at the opening of the Frankfurt Book Fair from like a process of modern colonization of property rights there, and I think he's quite right. But speech won't change a thing. So what we need to do is we need to talk about copyrights, and we need to make sure that they can also be enforced in confronting AI. I think the ship on the question of sailing of training of AI models, large language models, has sailed. And because that has happened already, these things have trained. I think what's interesting and important at the moment for media outlets is the question of information grounding. So what is going on if I have like a question of what was going on yesterday in the German parliament? It's quite obvious that if you don't want to have an AI answer that's just hallucinated from whatever has been talked about in the last 50 years in Parliament, but actually answering the question, you need to have some actual public information that you need to refer to. And so what I think we need to do is we need to make these things part of license models. It should be possible to license and also to decline a license for use. And one thing, we need to have water stamps on them as well, so that we can actually see what is AI generated, what is not AI generated. Something that's also interesting for AI business as well, because they need to differentiate for themselves too, because the AI generated content isn't as valuable as the other one, because if you just start to develop patterns upon patterns upon patterns, they become rougher and rougher and rougher and less acute. And in the end, I think we also need to have a fight that is on sort of a moral and ethical and political level, on the question of, do we actually trust technology to give the kind of information and the kind of orientation that we expect from a journalistic source? And so there will be nothing that we're going to be doing in a couple of years, and some argue even today there's nothing that we are doing online that hasn't already artificial intelligence in it. But the question is, in the end, is it just a product by the AI all the way up to the end to what is published, or is it just a tool that we use in order to do a better research, to write a better article, to hit target groups better than we did before? But in the end, there is some editorial staff that's actually taking responsibility for what is being published. And I think that this is something that we cannot regulate, but that is something that an industry also has to decide that it wants to have the responsibility still within the human creation process in the end. We have it even more. That's why I'm also responsible for cultural policies. It's even more the case there when you talk with music, with the music industry, on whether or not there will be a difference. Will we have bands in 20 years, or will it all be just made up by AI? And I think in the end, our audiences want people to stand for what was being published, if it's more than just a commodity. And I think that's what we need to fight for in order to have this. And then we can help with regulation. But at the moment, the problem for regulation is that the public sphere doesn't even understand the problem that we are trying to formulate a solution to. So we need to have a common idea of that there is a problem in order to go the next step. And I really think that the biggest thing is really copyright at that place, where we can actually make sure that a large language model and an AI bot cannot just use anything that is out there, but that there needs to be some sort of agreement with the ones that actually hold the technological facility where the content is in. We have Leistungsschutzrechte and stuff like that that we can use for that, but we need to do it as well. And at the moment, there's very little movement in this field because everybody is afraid that once you start copyrights, you have another fruitless discussion like we had the last time, when basically everything was stalled for 5 or 6 years and nobody was able to agree on anything on a European level. But it is important. And in the end, on the other hand as well, I'm pretty sure that in a couple of years, AI-generated content will have a copyright as well, which it doesn't have at the moment. And then we also have an alignment there again, because then it's not as universally usable as it is at the moment, because it will sooner or later have something that we in German law call Schöpfungshöhe, level of creative quality, if you want to say so, that qualifies it for copyright as well. So I have not the perfect answer, but I have a couple of questions that we need to answer collectively.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you.
Without knowing, you've given us a brilliant segue to our next panel discussion, which is all about technology and
Great.
AI. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
And we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And we're with you on that
Yeah.
mission that you gave us.
Enjoy Hamburg. Enjoy the sun. It's always like this here. Ask the Hamburg people here. Bye.